Dunlap from the Milwaukee chapter of NSS. He's also the executive director of LUNAX, Lunar National Agricultural Experiment, research opportunities for students in Green Bay. And he'll be addressing several issues on solar power economics here. David?
Those of you who attended the earlier sessions heard Dr. Peter Glazer and Dr. Dave Criswell talk about different space-derived power options that they have studied. In looking at global energy problems, other economists have looked at conclusions. One is Dr. Robert Kaufman at the University of Boston. He has taken a look at our conventional fuel energy situation. I have briefly shown some graphs that he's produced. If we have a hard path type of economic system based on coal plants and central generation, he's projecting our gross national product in that scenario, the per capita gross national product peaking about the end of the century and falling off. This is based on assumptions on the fuel mixes that are involved. And you can see basically that we go from a significant dependence on oil and shift largely over to coal. The fraction of the supply that's natural gas, nuclear, hydro, and so forth, and other alternative energy modes is those are a fraction. In looking at using a mix of conservation and more heavily emphasizing alternative energy supplies, he has a very similar curve in terms of a declining gross national product. So these are not particularly pretty numbers or pretty scenarios in terms of our standard of living and what we can expect just with the status quo, a range of options in terms of the status quo type of addressable energy sources. One of the specialties, which I think is really knows that the impact of a variety of these different paths on our ratio of food output in our agricultural economy for the amount of energy we put in also is not very favorable. And the soft path is the most favorable, but we see declining. We have to put more energy in for declining food output. If you go to more of a coal-based system, if you operate a steam tractor, for example, with coal, like we did around the turn of the century, you're not as efficient as you are with a petroleum tractor. When you lose your petroleum, you have a significant impact because you have an increase in your energy cost. It becomes less efficient to farm. Amount of energy available to supply. Some of his models show, for example, that we have a pretty healthy export economy in agriculture. That's one of our biggest industries. And by 2025, we could see that very significantly reduced based on, the increasing projected costs for petroleum fuels and other alternatives. The worst case scenario is we actually not only lose our export capacity, but even get probably in domestic demand. So these numbers are not basically out of line with the energy crisis that Dr. Criswell was outlining. And it shows that the impacts are, at least in the agricultural economy, would create some very severe repercussions. This is another graph of what might happen to exports under various computer models that we're running. Dr. Glazer material basically talked about a terracing of a growth path toward solar power satellites. And the early parts of this terrace are basically doing some demonstrations to the space shuttle and technology demonstrations. The interesting thing is you can start to see don't have an easy solution. Dr. Criswell's path also shows a variety of technology development. An interesting part of this are his solar and mirror reflectors. And one of the things that has occurred to me in this scheme is that if one moves the solar power collector system from the last place to the first place, you can create a solar electric grid. And we created a telecommunications industry in a very, very short period. Sputnik went up in 1957, and we were watching football games and soccer matches in the early 70s with the communication satellite industry, and that remains probably the only viable, profitable kind of industry we have. It seems to me that one of the potential markets for this technology in the near term would be to create a similar series of these microwave mirrors and to install the capacity to ship and sell power around the world. That is an essential part of the ultimate scheme that Dr. Criswell just presented. And indeed, with this scheme, one can't get continuous baseload power without a series of reflectors, both in lunar orbit and terrestrial orbit. By changing the order of development, you not only improve the technology, but you create an immediate huge market for power sales in the short term. One of the other considerations that has to be faced is what the politics will look like internationally. And the developed countries basically are living a high standard of living because of the amount of power that they consume. The third world, with a growing population, is sinking and going backwards. And it's only those countries which have achieved a high standard of living who will stabilize their population. It's unlikely that we're going to see population stabilization unless they as well have a high standard of living. So the power, the amounts of power that the space-derived schemes present is probably the only real way of addressing the population crisis and the environmental crisis that flows from them. I think it's probably the most appealing part of it is that this provides a practical way of increasing the standard of living for people who otherwise have no hope of conventional kind of methodology. The United Nations basically completed a recent study showing that the G7 countries, the advanced nations, use about 80% of the world's resources. And it seems politically unsupportable to assume that that kind of state of affairs can continue when just the advanced economies are rapidly using up the existing power supplies, much less offering no hope for any change in the status quo of the world. I think that we have probably seen only the most recent conflict, Desert Storm, with the Persian Gulf energy supply. And the space-derived power, I think, also speaks to the international security issues involved, because if we go to the solar-derived system, then we diversify our dependence on terrestrial sources. To the extent that they're U.S.-owned, we become the new OPEC, as it were. We have assured our own energy supplies as well as having the position to market to other people. That is only part of the issue, however. If we go back to the 70s and we saw the huge transfer of wealth that occurred during the 1970s because of the oil crisis and the increase in petroleum prices, that has produced some significant distortions in the world economy. We got not only huge price increases, but that had severe impacts on the international banking community. A lot of the money was lent that can't be repaid to the third world. We're seeing the consequences today from that imbalance in terms of the amount of cash that was available, the amount of money that was loaned, and then the subsequent ability to pay back. So it's the technology of lunar power is perhaps the easiest part. To devise a financial system that allows other people to expand the market so that they can absorb that investment is ultimately, I think, the critical issue in whether this can be politically feasible and economically feasible. think a series of practical questions should be asked about this. Looking at some of Dr. Criswell's figures, well, he had projected in his bar graph spending about $700 billion to create his lunar power reference system. And so, let's say it's 700, why not go $1 trillion? Where do we get $1 trillion? The only countries I think that possibly could raise that amount of money are the G7 countries. If you take a look at the U.S. economy, we just spent $1 trillion on arms during the 80s, and we went from the largest predator nation to the largest debtor nation. On the other hand, the U.S. Department of Energy, Office of Planning and Policy Analysis, was forecasting electric needs for the year 2000. Back in 1983, they estimated that it would take about $1 trillion investment to increase the power supply from 572 gigawatts to 900 gigawatts. That analysis requires an increase of 438 gigawatts capacity if replacements of retired plant capacity and new capacity are combined. So the magnitude of investment that we're talking about with Dr. Criswell is no greater than the conventional magnitude of investment that we were otherwise projecting with fossil fuels. And so when we say, where are we going to get the money? The answer is the same place that we would have gotten it for our conventional supply. Now, politically directing that and convincing people, I think, is another question. But in terms of the power demand of just the U.S. economy, the scale of activity that we're talking about is well within the conventional investment requirements that the existing electric power industry has. In competition with existing electric power, there's the question of what assumptions you base, what costs will be available. There are a lot of unknowns. We haven't actually gone up and ever tried to build a lunar collector array on the moon. So there are lots of uncertainties as to the actual cost when we go into an operating environment of that sort. On the other hand, I think there are also a lot of cost uncertainties in terms of the existing price structure for fossil fuels. And existing environmental regulations, if we scrub our plants, the amount of investment to clean up coal-fired plants is going to increase those prices very considerably as well in the next 40, 50 years. So the existing comparisons, I think, are really very difficult to make because much of our existing energy supply is very much underpriced in terms of what it's actually costing us. We haven't, if we were rational, we would have built the cost of Desert Storm into the cost of all Persian Gulf oil, and tacking that onto the cost of oil would have been a fair market, a market-based system, pricing the true cost of that energy. So our existing conventional supports, our existing supply doesn't really honestly reflect the true cost of doing business. I think, therefore, the comparisons, even if there are uncertainties in the space around power supply systems, that they still compete rather well because of the external costs that have not been included in terms of our existing way of doing business. The big problem is, how do you get people to give you $1 trillion for 30 years when you don't, in fact, have a substantial product to sell until fairly late in the game? And I think that's as a practical matter something that I don't think the technology scenarios alone will address. I think by going to a shorter term, by terracing the process the way Peter Glaser has, if we create a global electric grid first, we will have taken a major step along that path with a much shorter practical payback. The payback will be that we can stretch our existing energy, we can make our existing plant capacity more efficient. We can use our existing plants. We have a trade-off, therefore, between the need not to build new plants and what we can put into creating a global electric grid. The Department of Commerce, I believe they estimated that in 1991 there would be $24 billion invested in the electric utility industry in the United States. By the same token, the entire launch industry is many times smaller than that in terms of satellite markets. So if we expand, if we would develop a ComSat type of corporation and build our global electric grid with these reflecting mirrors, that would be a significant potential source of financing from the existing volume of plant construction. And that, I think, may be one very viable area for further economic studies in terms of how we actually start to get these space-derived power options financed. This would not be government money, this is utility money we're talking about. If we created such a corporation, ComSat worked very well. We had a corporation that was basically set up by the U.S. government with international partners, private investors, and their board members that were the U.S. government. But it was basically driven by private investors. If we went to our G7 partners with such a scheme, the way we did with ComSat, we would create an international enterprise. And since our space contractors are also international, such a corporation could, by not single sourcing these components, create some competition among potential suppliers, even of those countries that were part of the investment pool. And I believe come up with some practical and cost-efficient competition to make the satellite system feasible. As far as investment, the risk on the capital, I think that the initial stages of this will have to be underwritten with government money. The insurance cost of existing launches runs 16 to 20%, and so you can either pay the private insurance market to do that, or you can have the government for the early demonstration projects underwrite that kind of risk. So I think once that you've created a practical reflector satellite, and you now have a product with billions of dollars worth of energy flowing through that global electric grid, then it should be a rather self-financing process in terms of being able to insure that risk and create the first leg of development. If we look at the various steps, one of the scenarios looking at the development path, the Electric Power Research Institute, for example, has a $400 million annual budget. Very little of that, to my understanding, is really involved in space-related research. But there's a potential source of non-government funding to take a look at some of the projects and investments that Dr. Glazer have identified. In terms of the lift capacity, we are in the process of looking at an advanced launch system. We also have the options of trying to acquire energy as far as heavy lift capacity. Or we can take a look at modifying and using a shuttle drive kind of vehicle for heavy lift capacity. But if we're going to go up and put substantial satellites in Enterprise, we need that technology. There's certainly an opportunity for synergy there. And there again, in terms of direct trade-off with the Soviet economy, rather than granting them just several $billion, it's probably much more reasonable to give them to buy a viable product from them, which they can sell us, which would be some of the heavy lift capacity that we need. At least we have something immediately to show for our money. A fourth step would be to actually build these satellites. We need the heavy lift capacity. We need further development of that hardware. There's certainly a trade-off in the piece evident that we're looking at what DOE is doing right now. The market for nuclear bombs and for national lab manpower is diminishing. This certainly provides a trade-off in terms of alternative deployment to refine some of the practical applications that we require and not reduce the level of effort that we're making there and simply redirect it. If we get into an expanded network of energy, of microwave reflectors and satellites that are part of a huge multi-billion-dollar power grid, the market to repair and service those satellites means that the demand for rocket fuels goes up, that also means the advantage of having lunar sourced oxygen. We have an expanded and practical use for that market. So that gives us a further justification to accelerate our lunar production. The environmental risks associated with power beaming, I think, is an area that I don't know if it's completely addressed, but I think there's certainly more demonstration, and I think that's going to be a political issue. It's nice to say we should put it on our shopping center, but there will be some people, I'm sure, who would shop elsewhere if they knew that that was the case. And I think a lot of additional environmental studies of those type of activities should also be undertaken as part of the political process as far as making that a saleable proposition. There are some potential showstoppers, and if there were some significant and rapid breakthroughs in fusion technology, for example, the need to go out and build a solar collector, for example, could be greatly lessened. But that's not true for helium-3. We'd still have to get that from off-Earth sources. But a reasonable fusion program, I think, would be a significant showstopper. By the same token, if we had a significant breakthrough in superconductivity, high-temperature superconductivity, the economic justification for global economic grid through the satellites, could be significantly undercut. So we're, in essence, seeing that kind of competition today between fiber optic communication and satellite communication. So there are some alternative technology scenarios that could interrupt the growth path that I'm suggesting relative to the creation of the global electric power grid. But those are speculative. At the present time, those are the not options. We can't construct a solar superconducting terrestrial-based global power grid. So the satellite still looks like a very viable kind of option. I have suggested that a ComSat type corporation be set up to develop this kind of new technology. And we certainly have historical precedent to introduce a radical new option. I think if we would place that enterprise in either our space bureaucracy, whether it was NASA or Department of Energy, or just let it come out of existing utilities, we probably would not have the same impact. But I think that if we created a new entity parallel to ComSat, that if we build it, they would come. If there's a way to sell power back and forth around the world to maximize the return on your existing plant, if I can give you that capacity, why wouldn't you take it right now? I've given you, I've created an opportunity for you to make money simply by accepting my service and building a rectangle facility from the ground. One of the other showstoppers is political and legal. And the issue of the moon being common property of mankind is certainly something that investors have to wrestle with. Can we secure investment in a lunar collector field if in fact we can't have title to the real estate and control it? It's everybody's property. One of the other near-term problems that I think must be resolved is to create the legal and treaty framework that would allow the G7 nations, at least, who have the economic muscle and the technical capability to go up and do this. From a military standpoint, no one is going to quickly challenge the advanced high-technology countries in that kind of capability. But there's still, the other side of the scale is that the whole scheme only works in the long run if you have an expanded global market. And so it's the people who ultimately control the market, which is the mass of humanity, that make these 20 gigawatt kinds of projections, in fact, economically feasible. So that is going to be a showstopper. I don't think anybody is going to embark on that kind of investment unless up front we have some treaty rights in place that will allow some balance between the short-term demands of investors and the long-term demands of people who feel that they should have a share of the pie. I don't think people in the third world would necessarily view the creation of space-based power very positively if they see it as simply a Western or a G7 type of OPEC. We have the Organization of Solar Electric Exporting Countries, OSEC instead of OPEC. There's still the problem of having someone else's hand on your throat in terms of your power supply. We therefore need to have an economic structure that allows people who get into the game late to buy into that structure. And I think that if we do that up front again in the beginning, that we're going to have far broader third world political support. And as their market capacity and their use of the energy grows, they also then can gain some economic control and ownership of that mechanism. If we try and keep that only in our hands, I think we're going to have tremendous resistance and paranoia about this particular scheme. So I think it's, ideologically, I think it's economically smart for us to take account of those treaty rights and also to create a participatory structure so that as this enterprise expands to its technological potential, that it also carefully accounts for the expansion of the market potential in the third world, the ownership and control of those expanding markets in this enterprise. One of the other things I tried to do is to say, well, how do we take this kind of global scenario and tie it into a local economy? Now, I live in Wisconsin, which is a state that has virtually no local energy resources. And in the next, the state of Wisconsin has what they call an advanced planning process for its public utilities. And they basically take a 20-year look ahead and try and forecast the electricity demands in the state of Wisconsin. Our current advanced plan in Wisconsin basically calls for about 1% of alternative or sustainable energy resources and is almost entirely based on using conventional coal-fired plants over the next 20 years. We are projecting to spend $9 billion in the state of Wisconsin over that period, and we would construct 47 new coal-fired generating plants in our advanced plan. Now, for those who are interested in alternative energy supplies and the ecology, this is simply business as usual. On the other hand, the forecasting and the market demands that they have are credible in terms of the Edison Electric Power Institute. It's based on a fairly conservative 2% growth rate, which seems to be the one that Edison has used for our energy supply, electric energy supply in general. The solar scenarios, the space-derived power scenarios, give us an entirely new long-term context for electrical supply system beyond these 20-year advance plans. And using the global electric satellite potential, even within this 20-year period, I think within a 5 or 10-year window, Wisconsin potentially could be selling and exporting electricity through a global electric grid. There might be some trade-offs, therefore, against building those coal-fired plants in our 20-year advance plan if this technology of the microwave and the satellites were there. Secondly, in our advanced plan in Wisconsin, we're not looking at the environmental problems of continuing our dependence on coal. And so the benefit of this, of course, is that we're looking at a sustainable clean energy source. And this is environmentally necessary. This is also sustainable and renewable. We only have 1% in our advanced plan that is clean and sustainable. So this would certainly start to move us very much more rapidly into alternative sources of supply. We could, for example, use energy from a wind farm that would be constructed in the Falkland Islands, or from a solar farm in the Southwest, or from the Australian desert, or the North African desert. And our investments in those kind of alternative energy supplies, if we had a global electric grid, would certainly be as credible investments, at least some share of it, as the coal plants that we're now proposing to build. The energy problems that we have are still going to require, I think, incentives for energy conservation. The soft path people, I think, are clearly right, and that we need to be more frugal in have incentives for super efficient appliances and super efficient homes and so forth. We seem to have kind of gotten away from that kick since the supply of energy is relatively cheap again. But we're still living in, I think, the ultimately fool's world if we don't re-emphasize those things in our plan. And our current advanced plan is again, it certainly has certain components of that, but the main line is just build more coal plants and everything will be fine. The investments that we make certainly could be offshore, as I've indicated. We could use alternative, we had a global grid, there could be all sorts of different alternative energy investments that might be open to the state as opposed to just building local coal-fired plants. And some states in the United States are like Wisconsin, have almost no local resources. Others certainly have lots of coal, petroleum, or other kinds of resources. And the politics of that has a lot to do with the local rate commissions and who is appointed by the governor. So those people who aren't in the position to take advantage of the existing status quo in terms of the energy economy and politics have perhaps most to win from the alternative energy scenarios that use space-derived power. Minnesota has no significant local power resources. I mean, there's minimal, maybe 1% hydroelectric that Wisconsin has, and I suspect Minnesota is in a similar position. They also are a big importer. The Japanese have to import most of their power. So it may very well be that you would have a global convergence of interest. The people who now have to pay for fossil fuels and don't control their supply now could take a look at teaming together in terms of pooling their investment capital and looking not only at space-based power, but terrestrial-based power, some short-term bridges to make that possible if we had a global electric grid. So maybe Wisconsin and Minnesota investors would be looking at Japanese banks and looking at investment in not only power satellites, but alternative kinds of power production. So it opens up a much more complicated range of political and investment opportunities for local utilities. Now, the siting requirements initially for rectennas are things that were looked at as potential environmental problems, and you have to use up land for your rectennas. The presentation Dr. Criswell makes tends to minimize the actual extent of the amount of land involved. But in my view, it's not necessarily a liability to have conservancy of land, and if in fact the radiation dangers from microwaves are minimal or negligible, the idea that there would be significant areas reserved for antennas, if the antennas were built high enough, they could be built over farmland, or they could be built over wetlands, they could be built over very valuable pieces of property that otherwise they would be right in the path of development and not necessarily as well protected. If your utility has a good reason to come in and buy rectenna space, there may be some synergy between environmental protection of land conservancy and the siting of rectennas. And it's often those areas that are in the path of development in urban areas that you have the most difficult times of protecting. So there's another context where there may be some positives that come out of looking at the land acquisition and rectenna site. In Wisconsin, we're known as a dairy state. We have heavy agricultural impact. One of the reasons I mentioned Dr. Kaufman's work earlier was to show the disproportionate impact on the agricultural economy of going off petroleum fuels. The hydrogen economy certainly would be hydrogen fuels that would derive from electrolysis based on space-derived power would certainly help to solve that problem and give us another way of running our agricultural system. And there again, there's a whole range of there's a not in my backyard kind of phenomenon for large power plants, but the siting and production facilities for electrolysis, you can build those facilities and ship your hydrogen gas. You can do it overseas. You don't necessarily have to do it right on site. So the cost and the siting problems here, where you have a very tough political environment, might be much easier to do in the Australian desert. If you want to use your solar electric power supply to tank up hydrogen and ship that by sea, that's simple. There's a whole another alternative energy that would replace petroleum fuels that can be invested in as a result of this. And that offers, Wisconsin, for example, has a lot of machine tool production capability. Our ability to manufacture equipment to supply a hydrogen fuels industry that would be expanding certainly is the kind of opportunity that we're well suited to supply as a state. So there are some spin-offs, potential spin-offs for us in that area. Another area I think that also goes hand in hand with this is that each particular state, in each particular area of the world, each country has a very different perspective on a particular given technology. And so for us really to test the feasibility politically and economically of space-based power, there needs to be a lot of economic modeling done of these various sectors. In Wisconsin's case may be very different than the state of Texas, and very different again than what the state of Arizona might be facing in terms of how we would react, how our economy would react to various components of phasing in space derived energy sources. So I think there certainly is a need to model those various subcomponents of not only the states of the United States but other countries to see where those impacts. And it's a very, very complicated phenomenon. The models that need to be constructed for each area are going to show very, very different kinds of results in terms of what incentives and what disincentives, where the status quo is going to be more harmed than not. And I think that has a lot to do with practical politics and making this kind of scheme something that can actually be implemented in the real world. So those were some questions and perspectives that I had on looking at the case study that was developed with Dr. Griswold's and Dr. Polshinsky's and Dr. Glazer's technology scenarios for space-derived power. I don't have quantitative data, but I thought those were questions that need to be asked and further explored, looking at a practical use for some of our Department of Energy activities and the satellite reflectors. I think that's an area where we could progress very rapidly and come up with an immediate short-term payback. We wouldn't have to wait 30 years. We could be seeing something like that online maybe in 5 years and having a significant impact in 10 and 15. I think the impact of looking at every particular local economy, like I've tried to do and raise these questions for Wisconsin, is something that needs to engage the resources of universities around the country as they look at their own particular response to the opportunities and the problems that are created here. And if we do that, I think we'll have the ability then in each local market to frame political arguments and economic arguments that will help us sell what we ultimately know to be, virtually the only hope for sustaining a high-level global economy internationally. So that's basically what I wanted to say.
Any questions?
Yeah.
Yeah, you said you have no quantitative data, but do you know, are there any case studies out where anybody has tried to really, try to make a cash flow analysis of one of these minor projects or anything?
Well, Dr. Glazer, Dr. Griswold have put some macro figures together. And, that's very different when you say, this is the amount of power that I can produce. It's a very different assumption to assume that you can sell all that power and there's already a market for it. You have to take a look at what's being displaced, and I think that those numbers are going to vary from place to place. That's why there's a need, I think, to look at each local circumstance and create models that will accommodate this. Politics vary from place to place very much. If you're in a state that has heavy coal investments, the last thing you're going to be interested in politically in your state legislature or your U.S. congressmen and senators is pushing something that is going to erode the market value of your fossil fuel resources. At least in the short term, it doesn't seem that you would expect those votes to line up in that particular fashion. So, you need to have a good sense of the local politics and the local economic models to really get a handle on those impacts. And I think that is such a large amount of work that they haven't been able to address that. Yeah.
I don't know what got into the final version. Current energy bill that you might up here that it's maybe not too late to insert something if somebody's got the words. But I know we've gone through these exercises, and I know that EPRI has rejected solar out of hand for their expending. And of course, I followed some of the studies the last 4 or 5 years, not as intensively as I used to. But I'd like to comment as to, we have a window of opportunity, which is 3 to 4 weeks maximum. And the window of opportunity for the National Energy Security Act is Wednesday. Period. Unless somebody comes up to some of us and says that the Rules Committee that is still trying to haggle it out gets out of the box and it's Thursday morning.
Well, I don't know the details of the legislation we're talking about. I know in looking at the Department of Energy investments, they've been spending hundreds of millions of dollars of research on looking at coal applications and coal research.
Well, this is it clearly the rest for the next 5 to 10 years. I mean, the Senate's passed it, the House is arguing 776 right now, all 4,000 pages of it, and all the hearings and everything else. And yet there are things that I have picked up in the final listening, quietly upstairs, telling anybody what's wrong. I am hearing that some things that went through the hearing process with the National Energy Strategy, early public hearings, went into the white papers, and went into the pile of comments coming in, and then that magic date of August 1st, when the Ayatollah in Baghdad rolled across the border, and all of a sudden work stopped. Certain people carrying it on, but they were not the people that had the expertise. And then wordsmiths came in and put down the Senate President. We all have copies of it. But there were a number of things that politically got deleted out of the version that went to the President, which is in the million pages of transcript materials in the Department of Energy from the planning process. And this technology is one of them.
But it strikes me that people are very scared right now. And we see a decline in standard of living, we see a decline in environmental quality. And there's some very basic things that the public, I think, does not appreciate. Number one is how short-term our energy crisis is going to be hitting us. If Dr. Criswell's charts were, if you were here for his presentation, we're not really talking about very long-term kinds of impact. We're talking about rather short windows. We're having very severe problems. This is only going to accelerate the kinds of anger and instability politically. I guess I would have to ask myself why our elected officials right now, we have a proposition that can not only supply all the energy we need, but do it cleanly and safely and make money in addition. Why aren't they doing that? I guess I would be angry, but I suspect that things may have to get worse before the public is in a position to be angry enough to force some sea changes.
Well,
I think what you're getting is simply the status quo in terms of the existing supply options, and those people and those lobbies basically are controlling Congress right now.
We may see some changes after Rio.
Pardon?
We may see some very dramatic changes after Rio, and the National Energy Strategy is not, to me, a fixed-in-place document. It's got a continuous review process. But the point that I'm making is that there's a window legislative right now.
I suspect
will
that
become
they'll
national
sail
law.
right through that window. Have you noticed that unlike Ronald Reagan, in 1980, Ronald Reagan based his campaign on some simple questions. He said, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? You notice no one is asking the question on either party. Neither Ross Perot nor George Bush nor Bill Clinton are you better off today? The space-derived energy, I think, offers the only credible environmental and economic scenario for this country and for the rest of the world. And I think for us not to be in a position of saying, you know, why aren't you going to better be? You know, there are some practical and hopeful alternatives. One of the key issues that I think we're lacking right now is a politics of hope. And, you know, people are scared. They're seeing these problems are real. They're seeing a decline. We're seeing energy wars like the Persian Desert Storm come up. I don't think we've seen the end of those kinds of conflicts. And the longer this goes on, I think the more anger, the more frustration.
Sir, I'm not saying as the person sitting in the gallery watching it and sending, I sent one note in 22 hours, and that was it was time to go home for the weekend. But if they had continued on Thursday night, they might have got into a war over jurisdictional things because somebody's amendment got cut out by the rules committee. But I'm not seeing that. I'm seeing a marching all in order, all shaking hands and saying yes, yes, yes. And I'm seeing people opposing, say, yeah, come out and then introducing the next amendment and shaking hands off camera.
Well, you know, there's no law that says that we can't, you know, sail our economic car right off the cliff.
Yeah.
And we seem to be doing that. We seem to be accelerating toward.
Well, then I'm not seeing that either. I'm seeing a more reasonable approach, and I think we finally got through the education. It's been a long time, 30 years.
Well, one of the things that
6 times up to a planet. People that are older than I am have gone through all 6, and have written all 6 words.
Well, Dr. Schmidt this morning said there was a very strong correlation between the space program and environmental consciousness, at least in the public mind, in terms of forging the political consensus. And, you know, environmental fears have not been a very successful political driver. They really haven't dominated the political process to an extent. I think perhaps a better driver is the potential payback. Dr. Criswell's scheme is the only thing that I've heard. It's the only kind of national investment that we could make. It would not only pay for itself, pay for the interest, pay for the operating expenses, but also wind up with a profit large enough to eliminate the existing national debt.
Yes, but every pulp in this country is looking at the pulp. After the 3rd meeting that was discharged out here last Tuesday in the press conference, where all the stated heads of all our religion stood behind all the stated heads of the energy committees. And if you've not seen that, that's a very, very powerful impact on all let's go free and reason together and have no regrets.
Well, I hope you're right. And I hope that Rio has the kind of what you
You mentioned you didn't have much in the way of quantitative values, but maybe you can answer this question. Since both the risk of investment questions and a lot of the environmental questions won't be answered about a space-based power system until we have a demonstration project, seems reasonable that something like a small system placed in GEO, would be the first step in trying to demonstrate that these things are not unreasonable. Do you have any figures on what that would cost? Has anyone costed that? I know there were some studies done a long time ago, but do you have anything? Has anyone looked at that recently to see what that would involve?
The only thing that I have, I simply took the lunar case study figures that were done in 1989 on Dr. Kuczynski's helium-3 proposal and Dr. Glazer's and Dr. Criswell's work. And Dr. Criswell said that, they had to simply, they needed to restudy and do all of that. So I don't have, I'm simply using the old figures from the 1989 study and that everything I.
Do those basically rely on going directly to a lunar-based study, a lunar-based power system?
Yeah, both of those, you don't get any power out for 25 or 30 years. You have to go through the developmental cycle of establishing and building a solar power satellite or building your solar collector. That's why the overheads showed that the very last piece, for example, was putting the reflector satellites in lunar and Earth orbit. And that's why I'm suggesting that if you make that the first piece, you have something here and now that you can use. And so when someone turns the lights on and they know that's coming from the satellite, it's just like someone watching a soccer match or a political conference in Europe. You know, you say, oh, gee, here's something that's right in my living room, you know, and I'm using it right now. I think there's a real easy and fast appreciation of what that can do.
It seems like what's necessary is to have a test model, even if it's no bigger than something that will light a car headlight in terms of its practical applications, that it's something that might even, could be launched by an ELV or stuck in a shuttle cargo, stuck in the shuttle cargo bay and lifted up. Something just large enough to demonstrate the concept and allow you to do some tests on the environmental effects. But
way back in the 60s, when we were in the Vietnam War, there were proposals to illuminate by putting large inflatable mirrors that we might be able to illuminate Vietnam for night combat.
I remember talks of that potion, yeah.
Yeah, and what Dr. Criswell was just saying a few minutes ago was that it takes even less mass to put up a wire cage than it would an inflatable structure. So for a demonstration project, if we could build such an inflatable reflector satellite, just one, and we have a demonstration test with ground-based beaming and a ground-based receptor, I think we could do that rather inexpensively. What does it cost to launch one of those rockets? $50 to $100 million, and so I think we're probably talking for under the cost of a space shuttle to design work to go and put something, a test bed model in practice. Now, to actually build a series of satellites that utility companies can construct if you had a ComSat type of operation, I would adjacent to your power plant or run a line from I would build my rectanna. You would sell me your power, or I would sell you power that you wanted to buy from me, and I'd get my satellite system up in a very few years. Now, I think that we can take a look at the trade-offs from the existing intertie system. If you're looking at utilities right now, how they operate is they typically take the cheapest baseload power source they can, and then as their power demands go up, they fall back to the more and more expensive sources of energy. So, the last stages are when you're using natural gas-fired turbines and so forth, and when they're at full tilt. The satellite system, I suspect, would come in marginally. So, if you're talking about a new technology and all the costs, you would be looking at probably reasonably expensive power, since it's going to take some time to put this in. But at least it starts opening up that infrastructure, and I think once you have the capacity, it's just like telecommunications. That has certainly grown very, very quickly.
Well, one group that might be approachable is rather than the EEI CEOs, the rural electric CEOs.
Well,
they're all local farmer folks, and they have a widely dispersed grid, and they have some real problems in getting out 50 to 100 miles from where their tie comes in from the big utility, except for the state of Nebraska and the state of Washington, which are pretty much public utility districts, and has some unique characteristics.
Well, the federal government's still a major electric producer. I mean, look at TVA, look at the federal power projects. So those federal power, the federal government within its own context certainly could use those entities that are currently existing, such as TVA and the other national power.
But the rural electrics are the second largest and most active
So that's a second
lobby on the Hill. They are equal to, in demand, the private utilities. Equal. They have the larger number of customers. Their total energy use is 51% versus 49%. It's a fact that's very overlooked, and they also have one of the best people to fight the battle, Bob Berglund, as their executive director. Anybody knows Bob knows he's gone through the wars as the Secretary of Agriculture. And knows how to do it.
Maybe we should talk about it. Yes.
Have you looked at any scenarios for international cooperation? I think there's been kind of an unspoken assumption through almost all of this debate today, except for Dr. Glazer, that the U.S. would be driving the move to build our satellites. You know, so the same way we're moving to the space station. But I think that's kind of a shaky assumption anymore. The contractor for that first demonstration satellite may be Shimizu. As a matter of fact, I understand Japan already has a little undeployable solar array and a microwave transmitter and deployable rectenna concept scheduled for launch sometime in the 1990s as just a test model. So that's...
I don't know about the Japanese solar power efforts, but I heard Dr. Polshinsky speak in Madison, Milwaukee last week. And he said that he believes now the Japanese have shown such interest in space-derived power, as well as the helium-3 program that he is talking about. And I had
But they don't look at the possibility of an international scenario, which is very honestly the U.S. becomes, as someone in Japan actually put it, supplier for maybe Shimizu.
I think that's, you know, it's certainly not incredible to think that.
You know, we got to stop things for just a second here because we got to take some of this equipment and get it back out of here. But, you know, feel free to continue talking to me, okay, Mr. Dunlap here. I just got to interrupt a couple of things here.
Those are all three options that were in the lunar case study. And the Japanese have now a consortium of 50 companies who are looking just at helium-3 alone. So they're taking this very seriously. And I suspect that is probably just as true in terms of the solar collector technology as well as helium-3. Yeah.
You mentioned the TBA a moment ago, and when this was created, there was also created an innovative financing instrument, the 50-year bond, you know, which has now been repeated just a couple of weeks ago. What do you know about the discussion?
Did you say it was repealed?
No, repeated. You know, like they were able to issue another set of 50-year bonds.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, which, you know, allows them the long-term financing. I mean, what do you know about innovative discussion on innovative financing instruments for space? Because I think that's one of the limits, you know, because we have much too short-term financing in all these things.
Well, that's another aspect of this that I'm not an expert on long-term finance, but those of us who are in our mid-40s certainly are not that far from retirement. That 30 years from today is a very, a critical aspect of what we're going to be looking at. And so, if we look at the investment of Social Security funds, what better investment could we make as a country in our own retirement than to assure a clean, sustainable power source? I think the same would be true if you look at the public pension programs and government pension programs of other advanced countries. So there's an alternative potential source of financing because there is a credible payback. The technologies here.
Yeah, the Rural Electric Bank has 10 times what TPA ever had. It gets $1 billion a year out so at no cost to taxpayers.
So I think things like that have to be looked at instead of just let's go to Congress and get a special unique appropriation. There has to be some synergy from a variety of different sources of potential financing to make these schemes occur. And most people looking at these as a government, there isn't the discretionary income for them to invest unless they just print money. In that regard, having made that argument, let me make the last argument. If we look at economic feasibility, there's only one historic example that I think applies to can we afford this, and that's World War II. In 1940, before the United States was involved in hostilities, it was very clear to the U.S. government, to the British government, that war was coming. And in looking at that problem financially, it was estimated that World War II might increase the military expenditures from $3 billion a year to $15 billion a year. The entire federal budget in 1940 was $15 billion a year. So this was an incredible jump in magnitude in terms of projecting the expenses of fighting World War II. The reality was in 1945 alone, the U.S. budget was $78 billion. So the actual effort of fighting the war completely outstripped any of the worst cost projections that were made beginning in 1940. Those projections should have bankrupted the United States, should have had the same kind of devastating consequences in terms of inflation that occurred in England and Germany and in the United States after World War I. This was very much on their minds in planning and saying, how are we going to deal with that problem? What actually happened was that the investments that were made in warfighting capacities actually could be successfully converted. And so we had whole new industries arise in terms of electronics and commercial jet aviation and on and on and on and on. So it was kind of serendipity for us, but we basically printed money to sustain ourselves during the war. We sold war bonds, but the scheme to finance the war from internal resources just flat out completely didn't work. So the U.S. economy mostly operated on faith and credit in terms of the U.S. currency. And if we lost the war, after all, the debts, it doesn't make any difference because your accounting system has collapsed, all of your creditors, you're out of business, so the initial investment is lost. The reality was that the investment created an entirely new plateau of economic and technological capability. And so we were no longer trying to, we weren't paying off a 78, an indebtedness with a $15 billion a year federal budget and a much smaller tax base. We were paying it off with an economic base enormously larger. The same principle holds here in terms of the solar power system, is that if we look at the size of today's economy, we're not going to pay off the indebtedness that we incur. If it costs us $1 trillion, fine. If it costs us $5 billion, fine. If the payback is $10 billion or $15 or $20 billion, the size of the indebtedness is not really the showstopper. It's the size of the potential payback. And in the global economy, the reference model that Dr. Criswell used, he said would cost about $700 billion to construct, and over its 50-year lifespan would generate $13 trillion. Now, if one assumes that $700 billion has to be all borrowed, which it probably does, even with high interest rates, let's assume that you triple that initial cost, and that's your interest charges. So now you're maybe $3 trillion instead of $700 billion. If you're looking at a 30-year mortgage, for example. Let's assume, in looking at his schedule of launch rates and so forth, they actually declined in the last 60 years of this scenario. So, the early buildup and launch rates are higher than the last half of his project. So let's assume that the operating costs are the same in terms of the interest and investment as the first $4 billion. Now we're up to $8 trillion. Well, we're going to have a projected revenue of $13 trillion. So we've not only paid off our investors and with the interest on their money, we still have a $5 trillion profit. And that profit is large enough to eliminate the entire indebtedness of the United States currently. Now that's the reference model that he used. To supply the entire globe would require doing that 70 times. So if everyone were to have the kind of power consumption that Western Europeans have today, we would have to, if the global standard of living was that high, we would have to expand that reference model 70 times. So the potential size of the global market is unbelievably larger than the market that we're looking at today to undertake that burden. And if in fact the payout of electricity and power is available, the global economy will easily be able to sustain the level of debt that we incur today. Politically, we've been able to borrow from our children's future, and so we're stuck with, gee, how are they going to pay it back? Well, Dr. Criswell's schemes and Dr. Glaser's scheme offer our children the way to in fact pay back such a proposition. So the numbers are actually on a macro level very, very attractive, and I know of no other national investment that could be made that could be as appealing as that. So to go back to World War II, we really did not have a choice. We were attacked. We were facing threats from Adolf Hitler and the Japanese Empire and from the other Axis powers there. We were kind of pushed into it, and as really an act of blind faith, through serendipity, we made investments that no one would have rationally made if I had been standing here in 1940 and arguing about the need to spend up to $78 billion a year in 1945, and and it would have projected a U.S. economy of $5 trillion in 1990, who would have believed me in 1940? You know, would I have been pelted with tomatoes and cabbages? Probably, you know. So today we're in a very, very similar situation. We don't have Adolf Hitler to stimulate us and to make us hysterical, but we have the same opportunity and I think the same potential leverage. We do have a more insidious and creeping economic and environmental problem to deal with, and that's going to be harder to, you know, that so far has not been a sufficient motivator to get people to act. In World War II, the arguments were made it's going to be a lot cheaper to stop Hitler now. You know, in 1935 there were people who were saying that, and so essentially nothing was done. The status quo was not interrupted until Pearl Harbor. And there was a slow build-up. President Roosevelt was very frustrated because he could see it coming, but he couldn't marshal the political support. And I think we're facing a very parallel political strategy problem today, where we have an ecology war, we have an energy war. The consequences of not addressing that rationally are going to be just as disastrous as the World War II.
But President Bush doesn't see it coming, I guess.
I think he does.
Oh yeah, I think he does too.
Oh, no, I think he very much does. I think Congress does. It's that this particular and a couple of other technologies. I go back and check my reading assignments for tomorrow. I'm sure I'll get the last 22 minutes. It looks like it may have gotten lost in the mountain of paper. And as I told the previous speaker, there were some very good arguments made by the Texas people on some other aspects Thursday, and their amendment went through with 1 day. There may not be time if the Rules Committee doesn't allow anything new for this one, but certainly the arguments after Rio were a follow-on amendment.
Well, you know, who knows?
And I totally agree with you. So the small demonstration project, if you know anything about the history of the electric utility industry in this country, it wasn't building big, large power plants. And in the late 1930s and 1940s, my father went to board meetings and told them, as the builder of a lot of your power plants, I don't agree with the size you're going in. By the time he got to the 50s and the Woods decisions, he was screaming. He passed away last year, and he was still screaming. Yeah, he designed power plants, over 100 of them, for the longest license. And the guy going to here, 1915 to 1991.
My fear is that the political scenario that we have today will basically allow us to drift into increasingly unstable political times. And if we see things if we see a continued ratcheting down of the standard of living, if we see a ratcheting up of food prices, for example, the political stability that this country has enjoyed is going to start to unravel. Now, you know, we've seen a whole city blow up just a few nights ago.
Yeah.
And with a declining standard of living, you know, the separation between haves and have-nots in this country, the island of stability that we have imagined ourselves, that we have been, may be just as illusory.
Well, we once had community-based power systems. That's the history of the electric utility industry. And once we got up to 1,000 megawatt size, we no longer had a community-based. And you take this town right here, there is a 100 kilowatt Tico-gen to run the city, plus the water gate, which is off-grid, so you have to go in and wire it.
Well, we have a lot of good reasons. One is, if we do this, we can not only sustain our wealth, but we can be richer. Secondly, we can appeal to the third world. We can bring them up and share the level of wealth that we have. And ideologically, I think if we don't appeal to that market and help them up, then they're going to erode our positions. I don't think we and the other G7 nations can sustain the share of resources with that increasing conflict. And you know, it's getting easier and cheaper all the time. You know, to create mass destruction, whether it's, you know, drums full of anthrax or the cost of warfare is going down and the capability of warfare is going up. So it's becoming cheaper and cheaper to be more and more destructive, and that technology is spreading. We are not going to have a stable political environment unless we can include people in some sort of positive spin. And I think that's another very real issue. We have to offer not only our own population health, but we have to offer health to other people. And if we do that, then the size of the economy and the wealth and the security that people are anxious about, I think, can be very much assured. So that's to me our political education.
Is there a power?
Pardon?
Was there a power plant in there? That they built?
There is an incremental nature, particularly the Criswell study. It seems like it's one system, but unlike, the nuclear power plant system in the country is not a system. But the incremental parts are so large. If you wanted to up the power of this system, you just build a few things up there. If you want to install it, someone wants to tie in, they build their own piece, which is not as large because of the focus. It's not as large.
My father's point to 300 megawatts was absolutely correct. So it should never go. Not from the engineering point of view, but from the practical point of view, dispersal of the power system. Certainly, you could go to 1,000 megawatts, 10,000 megawatts. But then you had the long distance transmission lines, and he put in the first wheeling line in this country in 1931. And he calculated when he did it, the transmission loss from the hydro plant that he owned, 32 miles that he had to go and patched into Bonneville for all but 6 of the miles. Calculated the transmission loss, he said this is the way to go on it. And he built another wood-fired power plant next to the other 6 power plants that he had with the stacks from the pulp, paper, the lumber, the board, and the rest of it.
That's an example of looking at the local circumstances.
Lots of
We're probably out of time right
yeah,
now.
lots of things written
There's one
on
thing I want to ask
community-based
you.
power.
Mr. Chris,